Welcome to Starlight Sci-Fi, where the mysteries of the universe unfold before your eyes. Brace yourselves for a journey beyond imagination. Today's tale will chill you to your core. This is not just another story of exploration. This is something far darker. You've been warned. I was sent to erase a colony. Simple, right? A rogue outpost cut off from civilization, abandoned by the very empire that once supported it. But what I found there, what I saw with my own eyes, was beyond anything I could have imagined. The colony was not lost. It was transformed. And whatever did this, it wasn't finished yet. It was waiting, and it was coming for us. The galaxy was vast, and humanity had learned to navigate its endless reaches. From the glittering sprawl of space stations to the fertile planets where civilizations thrived, our empire stood as a testament to mankind's ambition. But with great power came great responsibility, and sometimes the weight of those responsibilities forced us into dark decisions. I had been trained for moments like this, to act decisively when the need arose, even when the mission seemed unspeakable. My latest assignment came without warning. A call, a brief message, and nothing more. A human colony had gone silent, no transmissions, no reports. Nothing. It was as though the people there had simply vanished. And the worst part, it was my job to ensure that whatever had happened stayed buried. The order was simple. Go in, assess, and eliminate any trace of the colony. Erase it. Make sure it could never be a threat again. The coordinates pointed to a distant planet, one far from the hub of our empire. It had been a small outpost, home to a few thousand colonists. At one point, it had been a beacon of hope and progress for the frontier, but that had been years ago. Since then, it had faded from the records, forgotten by most. Yet it was still listed under our jurisdiction. That was all that mattered now. We didn't need to know why they had gone silent. We didn't need to know the details. We just needed to make sure the problem never spread. The assignment was clear, the purpose indisputable. I boarded the transport ship alone. No one needed to accompany me. The mission was too sensitive, and my superiors were already anticipating the outcome. The ship's engines hummed to life, and we broke free from the orbit of the station, heading into the void. The stars stretched out ahead of us, cold and indifferent. During the journey, I reviewed the mission file. There were no signs of hostility, no reports of insurrection or aggression. The planet was marked as having disconnected from the rest of the empire, but that could have been any number of reasons. Resource shortages, isolation, internal squabbles, who knew? The file gave nothing away. It was just an empty, faceless mission. I was beginning to think it was overkill. A simple matter of cleaning up a forgotten outpost. A quick wipe of the slate, no questions asked. But as the planet came into view through the viewport, something unsettled me. The readings were off, distorted, almost as if they were being tampered with. The usual data on the planet's atmosphere, the terrain, and even the local gravity were fluctuating. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. There were no ships in orbit, no signals, and no immediate signs of life. Yet, it felt wrong. The calm was too perfect, too still. The silence was thick. We descended through the clouds, the planet's surface slowly coming into focus. It was a barren world, with rocky plains and jagged mountains. The colony had once been settled near a cluster of lakes, but from the satellite scans, it appeared the water had evaporated, leaving behind cracked earth. The buildings of the colony were now nothing more than skeletal remains, a shadow of their former selves. No smoke, no lights, no movement, just the decaying remnants of what used to be a thriving outpost. The ship touched down with a dull thud, and the landing ramp lowered. As I stepped out onto the soil, the air was thick, heavy with an odd, musty scent that caught in the back of my throat. The temperature was cold, but not unbearably so. Still, the world felt dead, abandoned not just by its people, but by time itself. It was as if life had simply been erased. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were the last living things on the planet, and that something had come before us and taken everything with it. The first step was simple enough: head to the Central Command building, where we would find the colony's logs. It was a routine check, find out what happened, and begin the process of shutting it all down. But something about the place made me hesitate. Something in the air, something in the quiet. I was trained to ignore fear, to stay focused. But here in this dead world, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that the emptiness wasn't natural. It wasn't just a forgotten colony. There was more to it than that. And whatever had happened here, it wasn't over yet. My mission was clear, but the unease creeping up my spine told me this wouldn't be as simple as erasing a failed colony. Something was wrong, and I was about to find out just how wrong it really was. The ship's descent was smooth, almost too smooth, given the strange tension in the air. The world below was eerily still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to break the silence. I had landed on countless planets before, each with its own unique pulse. Some were teeming with life, others barren but full of potential. But this place felt different. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, as if something unseen was watching, waiting for us to make the first move. I stepped off the ship and took a deep breath. The air cold but breathable, though there was a faint smell I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the sterile, metallic scent of a dead world, nor the musty decay of abandoned places. It was something subtle, like a dampness that clung to the skin, an unnatural weight that made my every step feel deliberate. The team followed closely behind, their boots crunching on the dry, cracked ground. We were fully equipped suits, weapons, and enough tools to handle any situation. But nothing could prepare us for the sense of foreboding that pressed down on us. The colonists should have been long gone by now, but the desolation felt unnatural, too complete. No wildlife, no rustling winds, no sounds at all, just the endless expanse of broken buildings and the dead stillness of a world forgotten. We moved toward the colony's central hub, a cluster of decaying structures that had once served as the heart of the settlement. The buildings were in disrepair, windows shattered, walls cracked, but they still stood. The architecture was familiar standard for human colonies, but there was something off about it. The shapes of the buildings seemed too angular, too sharp, as though they had been designed to look imposing rather than welcoming. As we walked deeper into the colony's heart, the sense of isolation grew stronger. I tried to focus on the mission, to push the unsettling thoughts aside, but they lingered. The silence seemed unnatural. Even the wind was absent. It was as if we had entered a place that time had forgotten, or worse, a place that had been abandoned by something far older and more sinister than humanity. We reached the Central Command building, which, though partially collapsed, still stood tall above the surrounding structures. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the walls covered in layers of grime. The faint hum of our equipment was the only sound in the otherwise oppressive quiet. I signaled to the team, and we moved forward, scanning every corner, every shadow. Then we found it, what I had been dreading but also expecting, the first sign of life, or something like it. The body was sprawled on the floor of a hallway, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. A colonist, or what had once been a colonist. The skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones, and the eyes were wide open, staring unblinking at nothing. But what disturbed me most was the expression frozen on the face, an expression of utter terror, as if whatever had happened here had torn this person apart from the inside out. The skin around the eyes and mouth was pulled back, as if they had been contorted into a silent scream, but there was no sound, no movement. We hesitated, standing in silence as we observed the body. There was no blood, no obvious wounds, just the hollow, vacant stare. The longer I looked, the more I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned to my team, expecting to see the same confusion mirrored on their faces, but they seemed unfazed. They had seen death before. But this wasn't just death. It was something else entirely. We continued through the building, moving cautiously, scanning the corners, the hallways, the rooms. There was no sign of any more bodies, but there were traces of something dark. The walls were covered with strange symbols, faintly glowing in the dim light. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. I had seen symbols like these in old archives, in stories about ancient civilizations that had once lived and died long before humanity ever reached the stars. The idea that one of these forgotten races had left their mark here made my stomach churn. The deeper we went into the complex, the more the strange markings became apparent. They weren't just on the walls, they were etched into the floors, the ceilings, even the doors. Some were scratched hastily, as if someone had tried to erase them, while others were precise, deliberate. They felt alive, as though the very walls were whispering. their symbols pulsating with an energy I couldn't quite understand. I stopped for a moment, scanning the room, but the more I looked, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing, shifting around us. And I realized, with a creeping sense of dread, that this wasn't just a forgotten colony. This was something worse. Something far older and far more dangerous had been here, and it wasn't finished. Whatever had been unleashed on this place was waiting for us to find it, to awaken it. As we moved forward, the strange symbols seemed to follow us, watching our every step. Something in the air shifted again, and I felt it, the unmistakable sensation that we weren't alone, and whatever else was in this place, it wasn't human. It never had been. The deeper we ventured into the colony, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was overwhelming. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd expect from an abandoned world, no. This was something different. It was as if the very air itself had been frozen in place, holding its breath, waiting. The walls seemed to close in around us as we moved through the crumbling hallways. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing on my chest, each step heavier than the last. We had reached the heart of the colony, the central command building, where all the operations had been managed. Once, this place would have been bustling with activity, filled with voices, with purpose. Now, it was nothing more than a hollow shell. The equipment was still here, though in disrepair, dust and debris covering every surface. Monitors flickered weakly, but the images they displayed were distorted, unreadable. It felt like we had stepped into a nightmare, a world where time had stopped, and nothing would ever return to its former state. I tried to focus on the mission, tried to block out the gnawing unease that had settled in my gut. We had a job to do: gather data, confirm the colony's fate, and eliminate any trace of it if necessary. It was supposed to be a clean, efficient operation. No surprises. But the more we explored, the more it became clear that this was far from a routine task. This was something different, something wrong. We moved through the building, cautiously checking rooms and archives for any signs of life, or, more accurately, any signs of what had caused this catastrophe. The air in the corridors grew colder as we moved further in. My breath clouded in front of me, even though the temperature reading said it should have been warmer. The chill seemed to seep into my bones, and it was hard to shake the sensation that we were being watched. We reached the central archives, a massive room filled with rows of data consoles and storage devices. It should have been filled with reports, records, and logs, everything that would explain what had gone wrong here. But as we sifted through the remains, we found little more than static. The files were corrupted, most of the consoles flickering in and out of life, showing only fragmented data. It was there, in the back of the room, that we found the first real clue. A large console, its screen cracked but still partially functional, displayed an encrypted file. I accessed it immediately, trying to bypass the encryption. The file was labeled with a single-word artifact. The name sent a shiver down my spine. It was the first time I'd seen anything even remotely relevant to our mission. I couldn't afford to waste time deciphering it. There was no telling what had happened here, and the longer we stayed, the greater the risk. But I had to know. The file opened with a single line of text, a message from the colony's director, written in haste. "We've made contact. It is here. The artifact is alive." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Alive? What the hell did that mean? The term artifact alone suggested something ancient, something alien. But alive? What could it possibly be? I scanned the rest of the file, but it was incomplete, cut off halfway through. There was no more information, no more context, just that terrifying fragment. It didn't take long to realize that the artifact wasn't some forgotten relic buried beneath the planet's surface. It was something that had been brought to the colony, something the settlers had discovered, and something that had consumed them. I couldn't help but wonder if the artifact itself had somehow twisted the minds of the colonists, warped them into whatever they had become, and now it was waiting for the right moment to spread. We continued our search, moving quickly through the building, trying to gather any remaining clues. But the more we searched, the more unsettled I became. The sense of being watched intensified. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. I would glance over my shoulder and swear I saw movement, but when I turned, nothing was there. The silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps, echoing down the empty hallways. Then, without warning, we found something that froze us all in place. A room at the far end of the building was locked, its door sealed shut. We managed to force it open, and what we found inside was beyond anything I could have prepared for. The room was filled with bodies, at least 30, maybe more. But they weren't just dead. They were changed. Their limbs contorted in grotesque angles, their skin stretched thin over their bones, their eyes wide open but vacant, staring as though they had seen something they couldn't comprehend. But that wasn't the worst part. It was what we saw next, the faintest flicker of movement in the corner of the room. It was subtle, like a shadow shifting, a small disturbance in the air. We were not alone. Whatever had taken these people, whatever had infected them, it wasn't finished. It was still here, and it was waiting. The room was silent once more, save for the faint hum of the power systems that still somehow functioned, and the sound of our breaths shallow and quick. I could feel the weight of the presence pressing down on us, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Whatever had happened here, whatever was waiting, it wasn't something we could just walk away from. We were in too deep now. There was no turning back. And I knew, with a creeping certainty, that the true horror of this place had only just begun to reveal itself. The room we found was beyond anything I had imagined. The bodies, what was left of them, lay in grotesque contortions, as though their very forms had been twisted by some force beyond understanding. Their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror, their eyes wide open and unblinking, yet lifeless. The horror of it was so overwhelming that for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, struggling to process what I was seeing. These were not just dead colonists, they were victims of something far more sinister, and whatever had done this, whatever had turned them into these twisted mockeries of life, was still out there. We stood motionless in the doorway, trying to make sense of it all. I felt the coldness of the room seep into my bones, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness that was almost tangible. It was as if time had stopped in this place, as though the very atmosphere had become infected by the horrors that had unfolded here. I could feel my pulse quicken as the enormity of the situation settled in. This wasn't just a failed colony. This was something worse, something darker. I turned to my team, but none of them said anything. We had all seen death in its various forms before decomposing bodies, signs of struggle, but this was different. These people hadn't just died. They had been changed. I didn't want to think about what that meant. The room was silent, save for the sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of the building settling around us. But deep down, I knew that whatever had done this was still here, still waiting, and it wasn't finished. I had to make a decision: stay and search for more answers, or leave before whatever was left of the colony found us. But the sense of dread pressing down on me, suffocating me, told me that leaving wasn't an option. We had come too far, and we needed to find out what had happened, what had caused this. We carefully moved further into the room, scanning the bodies for any clues, any sign of what had happened. I stepped closer to one of the bodies, my flashlight catching the twisted form. Its limbs were bent in unnatural angles, and its skin had a pallid, almost translucent quality to it. But what caught my attention the most was the neck. The flesh had been stretched, pulled in an impossibly long line, as if something had been drawn out of it. I recoiled slightly, but I had to force myself to stay focused. This was important. We needed to know how they had died, what had happened here. I took another step forward, shining my light along the floor. That's when I saw the faintest trace of something shimmering, like liquid, pooling around the bodies. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The liquid was dark, almost black, but it seemed to reflect the light in a way that gave it a strange, unnatural sheen. My heart skipped a beat. I had read about things like this in old, classified reports, ancient artifacts, alien technology that could manipulate life itself, warping the very fabric of biology. Could this be it? Could this artifact they had mentioned be connected to all of this? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this substance was, it held the key to what had happened. We continued to search the room, but every instinct told me to stop, to turn back, to leave before it was too late. The air seemed to thicken as we moved, the temperature dropping ever so slightly with each step. Something was watching us. I could feel it just on the edge of my consciousness, like a predator waiting to strike. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. My team was still focused on the bodies, each of us lost in the grim task of finding answers. And then we heard it, a faint sound, distant but unmistakable. The low hum of something. Alive. At first I thought it was just the building creaking, or some malfunction in the power systems, but no. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the sound was coming from deep within the colony, beyond the walls, deeper into the heart of the complex. I motioned for my team to be quiet, and we stood still, straining to hear it. The hum grew louder, like a distant whisper, growing in intensity. It was coming from somewhere close, just beyond the walls. The noise was almost organic, as if it were the very pulse of the planet itself. My skin prickled as the reality of what we were facing hit me again. Whatever had been unleashed on this world was not just some alien parasite or rogue technology. It was alive in a way we couldn't understand, and it was calling us. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn and run, to get back to the ship and forget everything I had seen. But I knew that wasn't possible. We had to find out what had happened here, and what that sound meant. We had to understand the artifact, this force that had brought an entire colony to ruin. As the hum grew louder, we made our way to the source. The air felt charged with electricity now, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the very structure of the building was alive. And with every step we took toward the unknown, the sense of dread grew, until it was overwhelming. Something was waiting. Something ancient. And it was not pleased that we had come. We moved deeper into the building, drawn by the unrelenting hum that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the planet. Every step we took toward its source felt like we were pushing deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The walls, once cold and sterile, now seemed to breathe, their faint vibrations syncing with the hum, amplifying it in the silence. My team followed in tense silence, their eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The air was thick with the scent of something alien, something ancient, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the environment became. The flickering lights in the corridors grew dimmer, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to move with us, always just a step behind. Every now and then I'd hear a faint scrape, like something dragging across the floor, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The hum was now a constant presence in my mind, low and pulsing, like the rhythm of some ancient heartbeat, distant yet ever present. It wasn't just noise, it was a presence, an invitation, beckoning us further into the depths. We reached a section of the colony that had been sealed off, an area that hadn't appeared on any of the initial scans or data logs. A large, reinforced door loomed ahead, rusted and warped with age. It was clear that whatever lay beyond this door was of significant importance. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but there was no choice now. We had come this far, and we had to know what was waiting behind it. I motioned to my team to get ready, and we braced ourselves as we forced the door open. It groaned in protest, the metal scraping against metal, as if it too was reluctant to reveal what was hidden. When it finally gave way, the door swung open with a heavy thud, revealing a large chamber beyond. The first thing I noticed was the faint greenish glow that bathed the room in an eerie light. It was unlike any light I had ever seen before, unnatural, almost sickly, and it emanated from a central object in the middle of the room. It was a large stone structure, covered in intricate carvings, the symbols from the walls of the colony now etched into it. The surface seemed to pulse, as though the stone itself was alive, breathing in the dim glow. But it wasn't just the stone that caught my attention. At the base of the structure, something lay sprawled on the floor. A body, or what was left of one. I could barely make out its shape in the half-light, but there was no mistaking the fact that it was human, or had been. The body was contorted in a way that made my stomach turn, its limbs splayed out at odd angles, and its skin stretched unnaturally, as if it had been drawn tight by some unseen force. I moved closer, drawn to the body despite myself. There was something almost hypnotic about the scene, as though the room itself was pulling me in. The hum intensified, vibrating in my chest now, and I realized it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the object, the artifact. It was alive. I crouched down beside the body, examining it. The skin was pale, drawn tight, and there were strange markings on it, marks that seemed to match the carvings on the stone structure. They weren't just tattoos or scars, they were something else. something I couldn't begin to understand. The more I looked at them, the more my head throbbed, as though the symbols were shifting in my mind, rearranging themselves in a way that made no sense. The presence in the room felt more tangible now, as though something ancient, something incomprehensible was watching us. The longer I stayed, the stronger the pull became. It was almost as if the artifact was calling to me, whispering in some language I couldn't quite grasp. I stood up abruptly, my senses reeling. This was no ordinary relic. It was a conduit, a channel for something far older, far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. I motioned to my team, signaling that we should move away from the structure. But as I turned, my eyes caught something else in the corner of the room. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but then it became clearer. A figure standing motionless, just beyond the glow of the artifact. My heart skipped a beat. It was another body, or what was left of one. But this one was different. This one was still moving, twitching in a slow, deliberate motion. It was breathing. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The body was barely human anymore, its form distorted, stretched, warped beyond recognition. It was a figure, humanoid in shape, but its skin was blackened, cracked, like burnt flesh, with veins of greenish light pulsing beneath it. Its eyes were open wide, but there was no life in them, just a hollow, empty stare. It was as if whatever had been human about it had been consumed, leaving only the remnants behind. The room seemed to tilt, the walls warping, the air thickening with an unnatural pressure. And then I realized the truth. This wasn't a colony that had simply fallen silent. This was a place where something had been unleashed, something that was consuming everything in its path, and we had just stumbled right into its lair. We needed to leave. Now. But I wasn't sure we could. Whatever had awoken in this place, it had already begun to spread, and there was no telling how far it would go. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on us. We backed away from the grotesque figure in the corner, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. This wasn't just a body, it was something alive, something that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, as if it were waiting for something, some signal to come alive and full. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck as the sense of dread grew heavier. The hum from the artifact had reached an unbearable crescendo, vibrating through the air and deep into my bones. It was no longer just a sound, it had become a presence, alive in its own right, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I could feel my heart racing, the pulse of the artifact matching the beat of my own blood. This wasn't just a relic. It was a force, a conduit to something far darker, far more ancient than we had ever expected. I turned to my team, my voice barely a whisper, urging them to move. There was no time for hesitation. We needed to get out. But as I looked around, I realized that the room had changed. The shadows were deeper now, longer, stretching toward us like fingers reaching from the dark corners. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they too were part of the artifact, infected by its presence. The temperature had dropped sharply, and my breath was visible in front of me, misting in the air. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee before whatever had been unleashed here could claim us. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the room itself was holding us in place, trapping us within its grasp. I could feel the weight of something closing in on us, a dark presence moving closer, encroaching on our every step. My mind screamed for us to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. The hum, that maddening sound, seemed to fill every space, closing in on us until there was nothing left. And then, from the far side of the room, a sound, a low, rasping breath. It was unmistakable. I snapped my head toward it, my eyes locking onto the distorted figure that had been twitching in the corner. It was moving now, its body shifting, limbs jerking in unnatural angles as it slowly stood. I could feel my stomach turn, the terror that had been gnawing at me now bursting forth in full force. This was no longer some abandoned colony, no relic lost to time. This was something alive. This was a predator. The figure's eyes locked onto us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Its gaze was empty, devoid of recognition, but there was something else there, something ancient and hungry. It opened its mouth, and for a moment, I thought it would speak, but instead, A sharp, high-pitched screech pierced the air. The sound was deafening. More than just an auditory assault, it was a physical force, vibrating through the very fabric of the room, rattling the walls, and shaking us to our core. We staggered back, covering our ears, but the noise only intensified. I could feel my teeth ache from the vibrations, my vision blurring. It was as if the creature's cry was reverberating directly into my skull. I thought I would lose consciousness, but somehow I managed to keep my feet beneath me. We had to move. We couldn't stay here. But as we turned to leave, the doorway, the only way out, had vanished. The walls had shifted, contorted, sealing us in. The room was no longer the one we had entered. The layout had changed, the doors gone, replaced by strange, seamless walls that seemed to pulse with the same eerie green light as the artifact. There was no escape, no way out. The room had become a labyrinth, and the artifact was its heart. I could feel the panic rising, my breath shallow as the reality of our situation set in. We were trapped. There was no telling how far this thing reached or what it was capable of. The creature, the body, it was only the beginning. The hum was louder now, vibrating in my chest as if it were calling to something, summoning it. I had no doubt now that this wasn't just some ancient alien technology, it was alive, a part of something vast, something unfathomable. And then, as the screeching died down, I saw it. Movement, not from the creature, from the walls. There were more of them, figures, shadows shifting within the walls themselves, just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. They were coming. Whatever this artifact had done to the colony, it had spread. It had taken the colonists and twisted them, turned them into this, and now it was calling us to join them. We needed to find a way out. But with the walls shifting and the artifact pulsing in the center of the room, I knew we were running out of time. Whatever had happened here, whatever force had been awakened, was expanding. The colony wasn't just dead, it was alive, infected by something ancient and alien, and we were caught in its grasp. There was no escaping it now. The only question was how long we had before the artifact reached out and claimed us, just as it had claimed them. The oppressive silence that followed the screeching was worse than the noise itself. My mind reeled, struggling to understand the horror we were caught in. The walls were closing in, both literally and metaphorically. Figures, more of them, shifted beneath the surface of the walls, just out of reach. But I could feel them, like eyes staring at me from the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the faint stench of something unnatural clinging to everything around us. The green glow from the artifact pulsed with a rhythmic urgency, like a heartbeat, its presence pressing down on us with suffocating weight. I tried to focus, to think, but my thoughts felt fogged, clouded by the very atmosphere that surrounded us. The hum in the room had become unbearable, vibrating deep in my chest, in my bones. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a sensation, like it was reaching into my very soul. I glanced at my team, but their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. They were as trapped as I was. We had no way out, no way to fight back. And yet the creature, if it could even be called that, continued to move slowly toward us, its jerky, unnatural movements sending waves of panic through my body.